Watch more programs like this on cable and stream with PCN Select. Subscribe at PCNTV.com. This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN.
Welcome to Season 3 of PHRC Speaks, Fair Housing in the 21st Century. I'm your host, Adrian Garcia, Director of Fair Housing and the Commercial Property Division for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. Now, civil rights has many layers that work together to achieve housing justice. You have your foot soldiers of justice, which include many civil rights leaders of the past, present, and the future. Additionally to that, you have the housing advocates that work at helping individuals attain access to housing that have traditionally been marginalized. And lastly, we have enforcement, people that work to help others attain justice through the complaint process, investigation, conciliation, mediation, and litigation. Which brings me to our guest today, Michael Hardiman, Esquire. Michael serves as commissioner for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission. He previously worked for the PHRC for over 33 years. For the last 7 years of his career at the Commission, he served as Chief Counsel for the Commission. He retired in July of 2012, but began his employment with the Commission back in January of 1979 as an Assistant General Counsel to the Commission in the Harrisburg Regional Office. In July of 1982, he was promoted to supervising attorney and moved to the Philadelphia Regional Office, where he remained until June of 2005. And he was appointed Chief Counsel. Mr. Hardiman additionally served as interim Executive Director of the Commission on 2 occasions, first in 2011 and again in 2018. After leaving the Commission, Michael worked for a period of time in a volunteer capacity as of counsel to the Philadelphia Lawyers for Social Equity, or PLSE. The PLSE is a nonprofit corporation that works with the community to reduce negative collateral consequences for those who have interacted with the Pennsylvania criminal justice system. Michael received his undergraduate degree from Moravian College in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and he graduated cum laude from William Mitchell College of Law, St. Paul, Minnesota. So join me in giving a warm welcome to Michael Hardiman. Welcome to PHRC Speaks. I'm thrilled to have you here.
Thank you. I'm glad to be here.
So, after reading your stellar bio, I know you have many stories to tell, but I'm interested in you sharing with the audience how you developed an interest in civil rights and in fair housing. It has to be an interesting story.
And there are sort of multiple aspects to it, some conscious and some less conscious as I think back upon it. I would say consciously, my initial thoughts about this in a significant manner occurred in the late 60s when I was in college at Moravian. The late 60s were a time, for those who can remember back those days, when there was lots of activity going on. People upset with the war that we were fighting in Vietnam, people upset with ongoing and civil disobedience on one side and lack of civil rights on the other side, leading to some of those demonstrations, etc. And so that was a part of it, the advancement of the women's movement at that time, because back in those days it was a two-dimensional workforce. Men had certain jobs and women had other jobs for the most part. So that was all a part of sort of what was happening. And I think the next part that started happening for me was when I graduated from college in '69, there was still a draft going on as a result of the war, et cetera, that was happening. And I then became draft eligible, and I decided to enlist in the Army and to go to officer candidate school and to serve in that capacity. And my experience in the Army taught me many, many things. But one of the things that negatively impacted me the most was to see the amount of ongoing discrimination occurring as we were being taught to be soldiers. And we were taught to treat other people, especially at that time, people with yellow skin, as less human than we were. We were being taught to kill, and it was as if it was okay to kill people because of the color of their skin, because of the war that we were fighting in Vietnam. That had a huge impact on me. It also made me think back. I think as I was doing that, as I was beginning that I mean, I grew up in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, or as we called it, Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, in an all-white, almost all Protestant neighborhood. We were the only Catholics in the neighborhood at the time. And while I didn't realize it at the time, just how much sort of discrimination, just lack of awareness of others was going on. Racial slurs were used all the time by the kids in the neighborhood. We were all white, and people would talk about people of different races if they saw them anywhere, or just in general, refer to them as slurs and as less than us white people in some fashion. These were things that I thought about more and more, I think, as I was in the Army, these things that were going on. Got out of the Army. Well, even when I was in the Army, I was eventually assigned to a station in New Orleans, Louisiana, where people were enlisting and were inducted into the Army. And this is where they came to be tested, to have their physical examinations taken. They had mental testing. We had behavioral testing, et cetera. It was all psychological testing that was all done. And once again, I saw the differences between people coming in and where they were, for example, in New Orleans at the time. There were white and black communities. They were basically separate communities at the time. And then and both whites and blacks were coming in, teenagers coming in to go into the Army and receiving the same kind of training and treatment of others that I was talking about, and treating others in the same way in some cases. There's also a lot of people coming in from the rural areas of Louisiana, from far outside of the city. And those people, there were separate communities, white community and black communities, never had much interaction at all. And then coming into the Army and then being taught to hate another group of people. And I started thinking more and more about those types of things, and eventually decided to go to law school as a result of that. And I had actually one of my professors in college had encouraged me to go to law school. He saw something in me that I didn't see at the time, but he had talked to me on a number of occasions about, you should go to law school, and how it might be important for me to do that. And so that was another factor that helped me get there. I went to law school, and during law school, I was working as a clerk for a professor who also had a private law practice. He was an African American, and he represented a lot of minority individuals in his practice. And I saw even more the kinds of mistreatment, differing treatment, less favorable treatment that African Americans were receiving, not only in employment and not only with respect to education, but also in housing, in all of those areas. These were all factors that helped lead me to decide that I wanted to see what I could do about that.
Excellent. And so I want to ask you now, with the many years that you had with the commission, there has to be a couple of cases or situations that help to reaffirm your decision to get into this line of work. What can you share about that?
And you're right. There were many, and they were both small and large. And maybe I'll start with the small one, then I'll move to some of the larger ones. One of the small ones was one of my early cases at the commission when I was still in Harrisburg. We had a truck driver come in who was denied a job, he alleged, because he had a disability having to do with his back. He had been a truck driver for a number of years and had routinely driven his truck and didn't have any problems. He was denied employment after his physical examination with this company. He filed his complaint. We investigated the complaint. We found probable cause. The case was not resolved, and we went to a public hearing. In which I represented the commission's interest in support of the complaint that had been filed and the finding of probable cause. And when we were starting the hearing, the attorney who was representing the respondent in the case actually stopped me and said, I was told you guys never litigate cases. So they were telling him essentially, you didn't have to worry about it because we weren't going to do anything about the case. And I just had two things happen. First, I told him, well, things are changing. But secondly, it underscored for me the fact that we as a commission had to do things to make sure we were enforcing the statute in the manner that it was intended to be enforced by the General Assembly. So that was an early small example. The larger examples, the two that I will present, had to do with school desegregation cases that I handled both in Philadelphia and in Pittsburgh, and in each situation for well over 20 years handling those cases. They gave me so many opportunities to see the negative consequences that occur as a result of segregation, whether in both of these cases, there was the so-called de facto segregation in housing that existed just as a matter of fact, not as a matter of law, but resulted then in segregation in schools, segregation with respect to social activities, and a lack of integration in terms of educational opportunities, et cetera, and how that also negatively impacts the lives of those kids as they grow up and then go on to look for employment, et cetera. And the difficulty in trying to litigate those cases. So that's the other one that presents itself to me, those huge examples of it.
Sure. And what I like about participating in this show, and I always thank Executive Director Lassiter for entrusting me with his pet project, which is PHRC Speaks, is that I wanted to redefine PHRC Speaks in that we speak in terms of not only through the voice of the investigators, but also through the voice and experiences of our commissioners like yourself. And so I think that giving people the kind of the internal experience that you have and why you've dedicated your time and your life basically to civil rights is important. So I'm appreciative of that. So now I have this question for you. How do you view your role as commissioner for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission?
Well, there are several aspects of the role as I see it as commissioner. One of those is an administrative aspect. It's to ensure that the commission as an entity is enforcing the statute in the manner that it was meant to be enforced by the General Assembly when the legislation was passed. And that's set forth in the statute itself. And one of the roles of commissioners is to make sure that we do that on an ongoing basis in the correct way. The other role we have another of the roles we have as commissioners is we sit on a variety of committees. And those committees are all intended to make sure that we not only are out there enforcing the statute, but we're educating people as well. We're educating them with respect to what the statute means, what rights exist, how the process works, and to listen when there are those who say, here's a problem with the process, or here's issues that I have with what PHRC is doing. Because we are a public agency, and as such, we need to listen to what the public has to say about what we're doing, and we have to examine ourselves closely in terms of what we're doing.
It just occurred to me as I reflect upon what we've talked about thus far and on your experience. I mean, you came up at a time and were in college at a time where it was the high point of civil rights movement. and then you come in and you join the commission in 1979, which is still fresh and still the high point of the civil rights movement. And I wanted to ask you, and we didn't go over this before, but I'm just going to ask you because I'm curious. Are we, in terms of civil rights, do you find us moving forward, or are we no better off than we were? How do you see that?
Well, I do find us moving forward, but what I see is that while the consequences of discrimination have not changed over time, the methodologies that underlie how that discrimination occurred have changed significantly over time, and it makes it much more difficult to do the job that we're called upon to do. And the most significant example of that is the notion of the impact that unconscious bias has in terms of actions that are taken by individuals who are not overtly attempting to discriminate. But, there are so many studies out there that show how unconscious bias negatively impacts the ability of people to be treated in the same fashion. And we have a statute that was enacted in 1961 when I'm sure at that time unconscious bias was also out there and negatively impacting, but it wasn't to the extent that we see it today. It was more overt, and so some of the cases were easier to prove at that point in time. But we have to adapt to that, and as commissioners, we have to look at those factors and ask ourselves, what can or should we be doing differently, and how would that help, or how would that impact on the population at large throughout the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania?
The Fair Housing Act was enacted in 1968, as you know, and few people know that it actually had two goals. It had the goal of enforcement, education, and making sure that we eradicate discrimination. But it also had that secondary goal of affirmatively furthering fair housing, which is an obligation that any HUD recipient or any county, city that receives HUD funding has. Are there aspects of that you believe we could be doing better as a Commonwealth?
Well, I think there are aspects that the Commonwealth could be doing better, but also that municipalities can be doing better. Because while much change has occurred, there still exists, as various studies have shown, for example, that there are any number of municipalities that have ordinances or other programmatic initiatives that can negatively impact on housing opportunities for different groups of individuals. And we have to look at those and we have to explore those. And the other ongoing negative part, especially in the housing area, as I see it, is the difficulty it is for individuals who are looking for housing of one sort or another, whether to buy or to rent, whether a long-term basis or a short-term basis. When they are refused or have hurdles put ahead in front of them, the difficulty many of them have in moving forward to go through the commission, for example, to have a resolution, because they got a life to live and they have things to do, and that's just one aspect of it. And the difficulties that can arise as a result of filing a complaint and what you have to then go through can limit their ability to file those complaints. And we have to look at that and then look at other ways to in a more general fashion, look at how to reduce the possibility that they will ever have to come to us to file a complaint, if you understand what I'm saying.
Sure. And so by that, I also, I guess, take it to mean that when looking at elements of affirmatively furthering fair housing, this is something that, because we are a Commonwealth, we have to take into individual municipalities that message and assist those individual municipalities realize how they integrate what they're doing in terms of zoning, in terms of reasonable accommodations, being able to kind of integrate those two into the fair housing space so that they are affirmatively furthering fair housing. Is that the way you see it as well?
That's absolutely correct. It's absolutely correct. And I understand that any number of municipalities say, look, we got a lot on the plate, man. We can't be doing all of these kinds of things. But that it is so important to do that. And the ultimate result is a good result because it helps us as a society. It helps the municipality in terms of its locality and what it does, how it serves its community. It's just a really significant step in terms of doing that. Yeah, absolutely.
Do you believe that there's a role to play for the Pennsylvania Human Relations Commission in providing some of this guidance to those municipalities? If you were able to diagram that, what would that look like for you?
Well, that's a tough one. Is there a role? Absolutely, there is a role. Exactly how that role will play out, I think a part of it has to be that we have to go out to those communities and we have to be talking to the people, those who have been negatively impacted, but also those who are responsible for minimizing those negative impacts, to hear what their side of the story is. What is it that prevents you from doing more? What are the obstacles that you see in this regard? How can we as a commission assist in that regard? How can others in the community assist in that regard? You know, it's not just a one person role here or a one entity role. It's all of us working together in order to do this. That's what it has to be.
Absolutely. I wholeheartedly agree with that. I think it's been emphasized so much as a reactionary measure when you're in an enforcement capacity. And when people begin to learn anything about fair housing, it's usually as a result of a conciliation or result of a complaint. And so the discussion is more punitive. You know, I'm here because I have to be, right? And so we have to find proactive ways to get the message out there. We have to realize the difference in audiences that we have, and therefore the different ways of being able to carry that message. If I'm understanding you correctly.
Absolutely. There is a significant difference, I think, in terms of receptivity to change that carries through in terms of how that need to look for change occurred. And if it is something that you're being told you have to do as a result of something negative, there can be resistance from the very start in terms of doing it, as opposed to coming out and working together in that community. What are the things you think you can do? What are the difficulties you have in trying to do these things? How can you work together as a community to make this change occur? That's what we need to have occur.
We've been going through the COVID-19 pandemic, and we have, the booster now out for these vaccinations. And so hopefully at some point we'll go to a new normal. But one thing that COVID did bring about is it showed that individuals that were vulnerable before COVID, their vulnerability was exacerbated as a result of the COVID pandemic. And so it has exposed many of those vulnerable populations and the housing equality or inequality, as it were. So what have your observations been? Obviously we all watch the news, we all see what's going on, we hear things, we're here at the commission and we always hear things. What have you heard have been some of the things that have been exposed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic?
In a way, as obvious as what you just started to say, it's another explanation for why somebody might be denied housing or why they're being forced out of housing that they might have, being told, we're not going to renew your lease or you have to leave. It's another methodology to use to try to avoid what might be the more underlying reason, or somebody who is in power saying, you know what, I don't want to take a chance because they're more likely to get exposed or to expose somebody else, and I don't need that kind of a problem. So I got to make sure I reduce the opportunity for that to occur by changing my rules.
Yeah. And so last question I have for you, and you kind of hit upon this in a couple of the answers that you've provided, but for those new housing providers, those new landlords, if you will, that are thinking about getting into renting, what message, based on your experience, what message would you provide to them so that they can have the best opportunity to be successful as a landlord?
The best opportunity to be successful in terms of what we do, let me just start with that,
Sure.
is to do the best you can to treat everyone in the same fashion. Equality of treatment reduces the possibility that you are going to be negatively impacted by somebody complaining about being treated unequally. But you have to make sure that you examine all of the practices that you have in place, making sure that you're obeying the law. For example, if you're a housing provider and you have a number of units and you have parking available, are you in your municipality, are you required to have so-called handicap spaces for residents who come in? If so, do you have them? If not, you are increasing the possibility somebody's going to file a complaint. You don't need that. Comply with the laws, but do so because you understand why they're there, what their purpose is, what their function is. That's a way to reduce the possibility of having complaints filed against you.
Thank you so much for that. I want to thank you for being here. I've learned so much. And really, I learned, if anything, and we've learned, that the people behind the PHRC, those people that are in the commission, are people that are in this because they care about the community, because they want to see a equitable society. So I want to thank you for being here and for providing us with so much information today.
Can I give you one more bit of history, or is there no time?
No, please go ahead.
Okay, and this is going back to the Human Relations Act was enacted in 1961. The predecessor to the Human Relations Act was the Pennsylvania Fair Employment Practices Act. It was enacted in 1955. Now here's the story. In the early 1950s, increased demonstrations were occurring of African Americans and Jewish Americans asserting their right to fair housing and for equal, not just fair housing, but to equality of treatment in employment, in housing, with respect to education, et cetera. They were doing all of that, trying to get jobs. African American soldiers returning from the Second World War, where, by the way, they served in segregated units because the Army was segregated by law at the time. And it wasn't until President Truman in 1947 signed an executive order that ended. But anyway, it's now 1952, 53. The then governor, I think it was Governor Fine, has a survey done of employers to find out how many employers would admit that they discriminate against African Americans for hiring. Some 52% said that they would discriminate with respect to labor jobs. Some, moving on up, I won't give you all the percentages. Some 87% said front office jobs, they discriminate against African Americans. 92% said they would discriminate against African Americans with respect to sales jobs. It's 1955. General Assembly is examining what would become the Pennsylvania Fair Employment Practices Act to outlaw such discrimination. The governor made sure every member of the General Assembly had on their desk in the General Assembly in Harrisburg a copy of that study that had been done. One member of the General Assembly, who was opposed to enactment, stood up and said, "I think discrimination, if it does exist, is certainly wrong. But too often, it would allow the lesser qualified to blackmail their way into jobs rather than others." 92% of employers admitting they would discriminate against, for example, in sales jobs. And he had the audacity to say that in 1955 in Pennsylvania. The statute was enacted. Boom.
Thank you. Thank you so much for that historical account and for being here today. Listen, if you believe that you've been a victim of discrimination in housing, visit us online at www.phrc.pa.gov or call us at 717-787-9780. We're also easy to find online on Facebook under PA Human Relations and on Twitter at PA_HumRelCom. That's going to do it for this edition of PHRC Speaks. Until next time, take care, be good, and be fair to each other.
This program has been paid for by the sponsor and does not reflect the views of PCN. To get your program on PCN Fusion and for more information, contact info@pcntv.com.